From the historic campus of Hillsdale College in Hillsdale, Michigan, where the good, the true, and the beautiful are taught, nurtured, and honored, this is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, bringing the activity and education of the college to listeners across the country.
If you're required to hire people for requirements other than their qualifications, their merits, then you're going to end up with a board that really is not very effective in running the business. And this is the board really decides who the CEO is. They have ultimate control over the direction of the company from a very macro respect. So it can be very damaging to your company.
This is your host, Scot Bertram. Welcome to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. That was Andy Puzder, attorney, author, and businessman, former chief executive officer of CKE Restaurants, which includes Hardee's and Carl's Jr. He's also the author of a brand new book, A Tyranny for the Good of Its Victims, The Ugly Truth About Stakeholder Capitalism. We go in depth with Andy Puzder about that book here today. Andy, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
The new book is A Tyranny for the Good of Its Victims, The Ugly Truth about Stakeholder Capitalism. And Andy, you begin the book, even before the book begins, with a dedication to Milton Friedman. And I love Milton Friedman, my favorite economist. There's been so much discussion over the past couple of years about whether the Friedman era is over. The Biden administration saying that spending doesn't matter, debts don't matter, modern monetary theory. Have those on the left buried Friedman quite prematurely?
Milton Friedman's theories work. They produce a productive economy where we have prosperity, where wages go up, where inflation is low, where you keep debt under control. Biden and his crew that came in and said that, stakeholder capitalism, now we're not going to do shareholder capitalism. We're not going to do Milton Friedman's version of your obligation is to your shareholders. If you're a CEO, we're now going to make it an obligation to all of society. That doesn't work. It didn't work in the United States. The Biden economy is, really is a dumpster fire economy funded by incredible debt and unparalleled deficits. And it's an economic approach that failed, and it failed in the former Soviet Union. It failed in Cuba. It failed in Venezuela. It failed in red China until they adopted what they called red capitalism. It wasn't even real capitalism, and it improved things. So what Friedman said works. Free market capitalism is even Barack Obama said free market capitalism has created the greatest wealth in human history and it's lifted billions of people out of poverty. He said that at Georgetown University in 2015. And if he's right, and he is right, why would you mess with a system like that? Why would you mess with a system that has lifted billions of people out of poverty and created tremendous wealth? I think the reason is because people like to use the economy and economic philosophies to gain power. And I think that's what happened in the United States under Biden, and it produced terrible economic results.
For our listeners, Andy, a brief definition or comparison between what you talk about in the book as the ugly truth of stakeholder capitalism as compared to shareholder capitalism. How do they differ?
Well, the ugly truth is about stakeholder capitalism is that it isn't capitalism at all. It's a rejection of free market capitalism. It's an attempt by a group of financial elites that run the largest asset management firms in the world, BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard, to impose their social and political beliefs on us. They claim to protect us, but really because they don't trust us to make decisions for ourselves, our nation, or our planet. Stakeholder capitalism is really a rejection of free market capitalism. Free market capitalism allows the American people to decide the direction of the economy through their open market purchases. It's also a rejection of democracy, which allows us to vote on whether we adopt social or political policies, and we don't have them imposed on us by financial elites. Stakeholder capitalism empowers these financial elites to impose their will on us by voting the shares they hold in American companies to, again, advance a woke leftist political and cultural agenda. Now, you might think I'm exaggerating when I say that. But I think if your listeners will think about it for a minute, you probably wondered why so many big American businesses that we've been familiar with throughout our lives, such as have been pursuing policies that just don't make any sense.
Right.
Like, why would Disney and Target, which are supposed to be family-friendly brands, or Anheuser-Busch, which is trying to sell beer to beer drinkers, why would they advance a transgender agenda? Or why would ExxonMobil and Chevron adopt net zero carbon emission policies when their business depends for its survival on the production of oil and gas? Well, the reason is because there really is a group of financial elites out there who control huge shareholdings in virtually every U.S. publicly traded company, who vote those shares to advance this political agenda, taking the power away from us as consumers to make those decisions for ourselves, where we want to take the economy, and depriving us of our rights in a democratic system of government to vote on what policies we choose to enact. So with shareholder capitalism, you really have the people making the decisions as to the direction of the economy. For example, if you like Apple as opposed to Microsoft, you might buy the iPhone as opposed to the Android. We kind of make the decisions as to where the economy goes, what products succeed, what businesses succeed, and which businesses fail. And if you are supportive of leftist ideology, you might go to Starbucks, or you might buy Ben and Jerry's ice cream, as opposed to going to their competitors who maybe have different political beliefs. So you can kind of support your political beliefs economically, or you can vote. So with stakeholder capitalism, they take the shares that they hold, these massive asset management firms, take the shares they hold, by the way, on behalf of others. They hold them on behalf of retirees, primarily people in the working and middle class who have retirement, pension funds, or 401k plans. And then they vote those shares to set the direction for the economy and the direction for our political future, rather than letting us do it ourselves.
Andy Puzder is with us. His new book, A Tyranny for the Good of Its Victims, The Ugly Truth About Stakeholder Capitalism. You mentioned the big three, and they are referenced all throughout A Tyranny for the Good of Its Victims: BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard. What are they? What do they do? Why do they have so much power?
Oh, they are asset managers. They manage investments for various groups of people, primarily, as I said, pension funds, 401k plans, retirement vehicles. They became very powerful over the last 25, 30 years because they are what's called passive asset managers. Now, when I was young, when you thought about hiring somebody to invest money for you, you would hire what was called an active asset manager. In other words, they would go out and decide which companies they thought were going to be successful, and they would invest in those companies. And then they would track those companies' progress so they knew whether to buy or sell the stock of that company going forward. Now, that was an expensive process because it takes a lot of effort and energy to do the research necessary to track all these companies' financial progress and what they're doing with new products or new management teams. That takes a lot of energy, a lot of effort. So there were fees attached to that kind of investing. A different kind of investing arose out of some people from the University of Chicago called passive investing, where you don't invest in individual companies, you invest in a group of companies. For example, the S&P 500 is a group of 500 of the most successful and largest companies in the United States. You invest in that group on the theory that, you've got 500 very successful companies. They probably got very good CEOs who are trying to make the companies even more profitable. They probably have good products. They probably have good profitability. They probably have low debt. This is how they got to be a successful company. And if they stop having those things, S&P takes them out of the group of 500 and adds in companies that have become more successful. So you end up with an investment in 500 companies, and you can't sell each companies individually in this index. You own the whole index of companies.
Right.
So it's a very diversified way to invest. It's a way to invest where you don't really have to do all that research. So the fees for this kind of investing are very low. It's a very inexpensive investment. And it turns out over time that it generally produces superior returns, better results than active investors do, because it's very hard to beat the 500 most successful companies in the country.
Right.
So BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard were all passive managers. And over the past 25 years, we actually got to the point last year where there's more money invested in passive asset management funds than there is invested in active funds. So they become very powerful. They now manage, combined, they manage about $21 trillion. That's 80% of our annual GDP in the United States, and it's larger than the GDP of every country in the world other than the United States and China. With that money, they've become the largest shareholders in about 80% of the companies in the S&P 500 and the largest shareholder in thousands of companies, publicly traded companies in the U.S. economy. So they've gained tremendous power. Now, they don't own those shares. Beneficially, they're owned by their investors, the people, the pension funds, and pension fund beneficiaries who invest with them. But they vote the shares. They get to vote them at annual shareholder meetings. They get to vote on shareholder resolutions and who are directors of these companies. So they've garnered tremendous power as passive asset managers. And it's funny, they use that power actively. They've really become activists in this sector, even though they're supposed to be passive asset managers. So the answer to your question, the short answer is they manage money for other people. They're asset managers, but they are so much more than that.
We're talking with Andy Puzder about his new book, A Tyranny for the Good of Its Victims. Do yourself a bit of good. Head right now to podcast.hillsdale.edu and click the subscribe button. That will bring you to a page that will allow you to subscribe to The Larry Arnn Show. Why should you? Because next week, a new show drops featuring Hillsdale President Dr. Larry Arnn talking with Sabin Howard. Sabin Howard is a sculptor and an artist. He recently completed the National World War I Memorial. It's fantastic. Dr. Arnn, along with Julio Suarez, chairman and associate professor of art at Hillsdale College, talk with Sabin Howard about how he developed his skills, his approach to sculpting, a few other works he's also completed. Dr. Arnn is very impressed by these pieces. They also talk about modern art, and there's a great section in which they talk about how you have to be okay with getting something wrong before you get something right. The Larry Arnn Show, featuring artist and sculptor Sabin Howard, is out next week. Subscribe to it now at podcast.hillsdale.edu. Click subscribe, then pick your favorite podcast site to get on board and know first when the new episode is ready. Podcast.hillsdale.edu and click subscribe to sign up for The Larry Arnn Show. We continue our conversation now with Andy Puzder, his book, A Tyranny for the Good of Its Victims, The Ugly Truth About Stakeholder Capitalism. Andy, you mentioned this activism of those companies and ESG investors. One of the ideas, or one of the things that is discussed is forced board diversity for companies. In Illinois a few years ago, there was a bill proposed that would have forced companies to have one woman, one African-American, one Latino on the board of directors. They watered that down a bit so that the companies in Illinois just have to list their board by sexual orientation, by race, by ethnicity. Forced board diversity. What's bad about that for business and for profitability and for the economy?
Well, first of all, from a moral perspective, since at least 1964, we've been working, which was passage of the Civil Rights Act, when we made discriminating against people based upon their race or their sex illegal. We have specifically tried to move towards a society where people are judged on their qualifications, merit, and character. You call Martin Luther King in his very famous I Have a Dream speech in the early 1960s said that he looked forward to the day when his children would be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. We've been moving towards that for many, many years. But if you have a requirement that you have to put people on your board of directors because of their race or because of their sex, then you've really backed away from, we're going to just put people on the board, or we're going to hire people based upon who they are as opposed to what they are. And that can be very bad for businesses, because businesses really should put on their boards of directors the most qualified people. whether they're black, white, red, yellow, whether they're male or female. You should put the most qualified people on your board of directors. When you require that people put people on your board because of their race or their sex, in other words, when you discriminate based upon race or sex, then you're really saying you may be putting people on who aren't the most qualified. So what that would do is it would favor companies that already had a very competent board of directors. If you have a lot of very experienced and competent people on your board, it may not hurt you to add a couple people who are less qualified. However, if you're a company that does not have a very good board and you want to increase the quality of the board members that you have with respect to their experience in the business that you're trying to run, if you're required to hire people for requirements other than their qualifications, their merits, then you're going to end up with a board that really is not very effective in running the business. And this is the board really decides who the CEO is. They have ultimate control over the direction of the company from a very macro perspective. So it can be very damaging to your company. Same applies if you're setting such qualifications for who you hire. If you're hiring people based upon race or sex rather than qualifications, merit, and character, you're first of all discriminating on the basis of race. And you're second of all, you're not going to get the most qualified people in your business. This is a problem that existed at Silicon Valley Bank. That bank collapsed. The bank actually had nobody on the board with any significant banking experience, but they had incredible diversity. They were very highly respected for their diversity. And of course, the bank collapsed. And then you've got Boeing that was bonusing its executives based either on the profitability of the company, or I think that was 85% of the bonus. And then 15% was DEI criteria or safety. Now, this is while they've got planes like falling out of the sky, right? They're making DEI and safety kind of coterminous.
Right. When
they really should have had safety at one point be like 99% of the bonus because people were losing confidence. So what they were saying with that bonus plan was we want you to do things that improve profitability. Maybe like use 3 bolts instead of 4 bolts to hold the panel on. That'll increase profitability. And then we want you to hire people not based upon whether they're the most qualified for the job, but based upon these racial or sexual orientation qualifications.
Andy Puzder with us, his new book, A Tyranny for the Good of Its Victims, The Ugly Truth About Stakeholder Capitalism. The profit motive, this is a Friedman maxim that you focus on in the book too. The actual power of capitalism lies in the profit motive. Why is the profit motive more productive, a better incentive than, say, ESG? Why does it lead to benefits for not just the wealthy, but also the poor in the country?
Well, the only way you succeed in a capitalist economy is by meeting the needs of other people. In other words, you have to satisfy your consumers, your customers' needs, or your business doesn't succeed. So what you have literally millions of people here in the United States striving every day to try and meet the needs of other people. This is why we have grocery stores that are full of food. This is why we have iPhones. This is why we have cars that were mass manufactured. Henry Ford set it up so even people that weren't rich could afford to drive cars. This is why we have Teslas. This is why we have Elon Musk and Steve Jobs and people like Henry Ford, who really tried to advance they tried to advance their own interests, in other words, to make a profit so that they could benefit themselves. But they realized that to do that, they had to benefit other people. So while we do have very wealthy people in this country, and I hear a lot of complaints about oligarchs, but leaving that aside for a minute, Jeff Bezos, who created Amazon, and Elon Musk, who runs like 6 companies now, these people they became tremendously wealthy, but they didn't become tremendously wealthy by stealing from us. They became tremendously wealthy because they provided us with tremendous benefits. And that profit motive is so important because you've heard, people have probably heard the saying on the left where they say, well, you can do well economically. You can do well by doing good socially. You can do well by doing good. That's the theory behind stakeholder capitalism and ESG. The point they're missing is you can't do anybody any good unless you do well first. In other words, you have to have a profitable company to benefit people, to create the products that people want, to create the jobs that people need. to create business for your suppliers, and to create largesse for your communities. You really have to do well before you can do any good. Now, there's nothing wrong with doing good. There's nothing wrong with addressing the needs of your community. You know, people generally don't do business with companies they don't like. So companies are often out there doing charitable things or meaningful things for their communities. You always want to have good employees. So you don't want your employees quitting and going to work for your competitors. So you always try and be very conscious of their needs. You want to do good things for your suppliers because you don't want them to go to somebody else and give them the good deals when you're trying to supply your business. And everybody, of course, is always trying to meet the needs of their consumers. So the profit motive encourages you to meet the needs of all these people that stakeholder capitalists call stakeholders, even though they actually have no stake in the business, but they're called stakeholders. By meeting the needs of your investors, meeting the needs of your business, you also have to meet the needs of these stakeholders. So the profit motive really incentivizes people to do what needs to be done to improve their lives and society in general. And you can see it. Look historically. Look at countries that adopted free market capitalism. The United States, we soared. Japan after World War II, it soared. Western Europe after World War II, it soared. As I said, even Red China that didn't adopt actual capitalism, even a little bit of what they called red capitalism, significantly improved the economic circumstances in that country. So it is very important. The profit motive is very important. It's a recognition of human nature, the idea that you want to improve your life and the life of your family. And it harnesses that to improving the lives of society and other people in general.
Andy Puzder with us, his new book, A Tyranny for the Good of Its Victims. We recently saw, Andy, a ruling by a judge against American Airlines and their ESG investing strategy that said it violated federal law. Does that strike a big blow against the entire concept of ESG for many of these companies in the country?
Yeah, that's huge. And I think it'll be upheld on appeal. The court was looking at a federal law. It's called the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, ERISA. And ERISA says that when you are investing money for people that have investments in private pension plans, you have to invest solely and exclusively in their interest and to generate returns from them. Now, it was passed back in the 1970s because people were concerned about the Teamsters. The Teamsters were investing in casinos in Las Vegas. And even though those turned out to be pretty darn good investments, in retrospect, at the time it looked like they were investing with gangsters and doing things that, maybe weren't in the best interest of the Teamsters themselves. So they passed this federal law requiring this sole and exclusive focus on the people on whose behalf you're investing and maximizing their returns. Well, you can't maximize returns for your investors if you're instructing the companies in which you invest their monies to pursue these environmental, social, and justice obligations, which diminish the profitability of the company. In other words, you can't be maximizing returns when you're encouraging the companies to do things that diminish their returns. And so the court in Texas said, look, what BlackRock did and what the trustees did in hiring BlackRock violated the provisions of ERISA, which are very, very clear, and they could potentially be held liable. Now, I think the Court of Appeals, that's in the Fifth Circuit, I think they will uphold that. Mm-hmm. And hopefully the Supreme Court will uphold it because the language of the statute is very clear, that you have to act solely and exclusively in the best interest of your clients, of your investors.
Andy Puzder is an author, speaker, and political commentator. He's also a retired CEO of CKE Restaurants and a distinguished fellow at the Heritage Foundation. His brand new book, A Tyranny for the Good of Its Victims, The Ugly Truth About Stakeholder Capitalism. Andy, thanks so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
It was my pleasure. Hillsdale's such a great place. I always love doing things with you guys, so thank you very much for having me.
Up next, Bart joins us from Hillsdale's English department as we conclude our in-depth series into the history of the English language. I'm Scot Bertram. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Hey there. Today, I want to tell you about the Hillsdale K-12 Classical Education Podcast. This unique show explains how children benefit from an American classical education. Whether you're a teacher, student, or parent, you'll find something of value on the show. You'll hear from teachers and administrators from schools around the country, as well as Hillsdale professors and friends who are leading the effort to revive the American tradition of K-12 education. When you listen, you'll learn all about classical education, what it is, how to teach it, and why it matters today. And there are dozens of back episodes on specific topics, like teaching Singapore math, reading great books, and even understanding how athletics is critical to a child's development. Listen every Monday on podcast.hillsdale.edu. That's podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio.
Welcome back to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. I'm Scot Bertram. We continue and, in fact, conclude our in-depth series on the history of the English language today with Dr. Pat Bart, Associate Professor of English at Hillsdale College. This is the final portion of our conversation. You can find previous chapters by heading to podcast.hillsdale.edu and looking at past episodes. Dr. Bart, into the 1500s and the 1600s, we have Shakespeare, pretty important guy. How does the printing press, how does increased literacy and popular writers like Shakespeare end up changing the language?
Okay, well, that's several topics. Let's just talk about the printing aspect of this. Caxton in the 15th century, right? So right around the time when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, right? He set up a printing business first in Bruges, but then later moved back to England. He first published his own English translation of a French romance about the history of Troy. So ancient Mediterranean stories still had a lot of prestige, and apparently not just prestige, but saleability, right? Because this guy, Caxton, I mean, he needs to earn a living from this. He needs to make money from this. So, you know, he's only taking risks on things he thinks are saleable, right? So maybe it's sort of like those movies about ancient times in the 50s. You know, those were very saleable, I guess, at the time, right? So Caxton, you know, has that sense that these will be saleable, and they are. Okay. He seems to have known that there was a large enough reading public for English texts that he should translate this text, this pretty prestigious text. He should translate it into English rather than just printing it in French. Okay, so there you go. Okay, so by that time, I don't want to read a French copy. It's easier to read this English copy, you know. And so that again shows, just like Henry V using English as a diplomatic language, Caxton is using it as a literary language, a language in which you might buy a copy of an august text about the fall of Troy, right? So about 15 years after Thomas Malory had completed an English translation of the French Morte d'Arthur, which we call by the French name, right, to this day. Then Caxton, he was approached, as he himself reports, by many noble and diverse gentlemen of England, I quote, who came and demanded of me, and oftentimes, wherefore that I had not made and imprinted the noble history of the Saint Graal, the Holy Grail, right? And of the most renowned Christian king, Arthur, which ought most to be remembered among us Englishmen before all other Christian kings. Okay. He depicts, this is from his preface to the Morte d'Arthur that he published. He actually sort of depicts a popular demand for this work by various gentlemen, repeatedly asking him, why haven't you published something about King Arthur? So this invoked his still popular 1485 print edition of Malory's work, which he typeset, and it's kind of interesting. At this time in history, the 15th century, Gutenberg does this too. He typeset it to look like the handwriting of his day. The development of the kind of clean-looking type that we have now comes much later, and wasn't considered desirable. Sure. Because what you wanted was the real thing, and the real thing was handwritten, right? So then there's an explosion of printing, relative then to an explosion of English literacy, which essentially is to support business and government, right? Government record keeping, business record keeping, various kinds of communications, right?
Dr. Bart, when you say an explosion of literacy, what exactly does that mean? Are we talking certainly not universal literacy, but what do you mean?
It's gone from maybe 1%, to like 30% or something. I don't know the exact percentages, but it's an explosion compared to what there had been before, right? And much further into sort of what we would call upper middle class, not just nobles, not just clergymen, right? So you can see English like regaining force because of this readership. It regains force as a language of letters. You see that starting with Chaucer writing tales for edification and enjoyment in English, though he clearly read French and Latin, and he actually translated from French and Latin as well. Mallory, you see translating into English, the French prose. So you see this building kind of readership in English throughout those couple of generations, until finally you see Caxton in his entrepreneurial spirit eyeing that sizable market for his publications. Now, Shakespeare, his works are not officially printed in his own time. And this is in part to avoid piracy. You've got the bad quartos, as early scholars of Shakespeare's texts called them, that are clearly pirated. They seem to be copied down from memory. One of them, Hamlet, it's horrific. It's just, to be or not to be, that's the thing. I don't know. You're just like, oh, wow, it's just going down from here, I bet, So here we see an early attempt to protect intellectual property, which is not really known in the same way in the Middle Ages. Now, if somebody attributed a work by gentleman X to gentleman Y, people might have gotten huffy, but you didn't see these moves to like protect your stuff, right? As much as you see it here.
Dr. Pat Bart with us. Dr. Bart, how did Shakespeare incorporate history and language into his plays and other works?
There's kind of a fun tie-in with this whole relationship between French and English in Shakespeare's England. In Henry V, Act 2, Scene 4, there is a scene that is entirely in French. And I'll give you a little bit of it. We have Alice, tu as été en Angleterre et tu parles bien le langage. Un peu, madame. So she says, Alice, Catherine says, the princess, says, Alice, you've been in England and you speak the language well. And Alice says, a little bit, madame. The way I always say about my French. Oh, you speak French? Petit peu. yeah, maybe not. But the scene involves Catherine, the Princess Royal of France, and her lady-in-waiting Alice, who has spent some time in England, knows the language well. She informs Catherine that les doigts, appelons, the fingers, are called de fingres, right? Okay. And le clude is d'elbow, which Catherine gets completely wrong, and she calls it the bilbo, right? And Alice then opines that, maybe the language is trop difficile. Maybe it's a little bit too difficult, right? Because of the body language, even if you don't speak any French, you kind of get what's going on. And you hear things like they're waving their fingers and going, de fingers, and the fingers. Oh, yeah, wow, that's like a ridiculous French accented fingers, right? Like the knights in Monty Python and the Holy Grail, right? We already got one, So it's that kind of scene. It really shows that Shakespeare knew he had important people in his audience who would have been forced to learn French as kids. And seeing a Princess Royal of the French trying to learn English and finding that hard would be very gratifying. To like, oh, she has to learn English. Oh, and it's like equally hard. Okay, well, serves you right. And we have to remember, there are no subtitles at this point. There's no, like at the opera, they don't have the words up there on a screen, right? So we, that was apparently he didn't think that was much of a risk. You know, he thought that would, this is gonna work, right? So there you see, it's sort of come full circle, the relationship between French and English at that point, where clearly you still have enough people in England speaking French. I mean, to this very day, there are jokey, like, let's parler franglais, right? Where people speak sort of like it's not really French and it's not really English. And yet the power situation has completely flipped at that point.
Talking with Dr. Pat Bart about the history of the English language, we march on into the 18th century to talk about Milton, another famous author, and the regularization of the English language.
Okay, so by the 17th century, you know, Milton, he's, you know, after Shakespeare, Milton comes along. The English language, the spelling system, the orthographical system, in technical terms, it has kind of settled down to pretty close to what we would do. But here's something quite interesting, and this is related to the printing industry. Surviving copies of a writer's work by the time of Milton, even in his own time, are mostly printed copies. Okay? The sole surviving copy in manuscript of Paradise Lost is a single fair copy, which is like, it's not even like the sort of the scratchy copy, you know, that you're working on. It's a fair copy, probably, you know, one taken to a printer, right, of only book one. Only book one survives in manuscript, and it's the Pierpont Morgan Library, okay? It's definitely not Milton's handwriting. He was completely blind by that time, so it's one of his amanuenses, right? But despite the fact that this is considered by Milton to be one of his, you know, great works, right? He entrusted its posterity to print editions. So really, at this point, we can talk about authorial publication. Okay, so you write something expecting to publish it. You hand it off to someone else who's going to make huge numbers of multiple copies, right? And then sell it to the public, right? That's in Milton's time. Now, if you think backwards, in Shakespeare's time and in Caxton's time, I mean, that's at a nascent stage in Shakespeare's time. But in Caxton's time, you might call it more like duplication because a lot of the authors that Caxton prints are already dead, right? And he just picks them up and prints them and sort of duplicates, right? You could say that that's publication because he's the publisher deliberately selling to the public, sure. But it's not authorial publication, right? Because Mallory, sitting around in house arrest, writing his translation, is not thinking, yeah, and I'm going to get this Caxton guy, but he died before that happened, right? So, and then if we go back to Chaucer's time, it's really more appropriately referred to as circulation. That is, I start writing something, I get all excited, I go down to the pub with my friends, I read it aloud. Some of them want copies. I give it to their secretary because, like, I got a copy back at home that I keep working on and changing. Okay, but meanwhile, they can make a copy. So that's really more like the medieval kind of publication, if you will. Very different. Okay, there is an example. Virgil was actually published by Maecenas and Augustus. Okay, but they wanted to get that out there into the public, right? But that's rare. That's extremely rare, earlier than this print era, right?
As we talk more about the standardization of language, we are introduced to a man named Samuel Johnson and the idea of the dictionary.
Yes, well, Johnson's dictionary was quite the tome, 1,600 and some pages. No one publisher could actually afford to publish it at the time. No, I mean, really, you know, a sort of consortium of people got together to propose this thing to him. He had been concerned that the English language was just getting crazy out of hand. Now, he's not the kind of, I don't know, Samuel Johnson is anything but a kind of schoolmarmish person. He didn't want to control everybody or something like that. He's sometimes presented that way recently in the scholarship, but he was concerned that people were just using English in a sloppy way. And then this was getting into print. Okay. So see now, it used to be, you don't have to worry about that.
Right.
Nobody is ever going to be copied unless they're top drawer anyway, right? Because who's going to bother? It's such a pain. It's so expensive. Well, now it's getting to be so cheap that everybody is getting on the internet and publishing themselves, right? Okay. I mean, it's only gotten worse, right?
That's right. Yep.
So Johnson is he's like, yeah, I'm ready for it. I'll do it, right? So he takes quite a bit of time, collects people's opinions about what a word means or the proper usage of words, adjudicates amongst these opinions. He also is at pains to get attestation of the use of words from context. Okay, and usually in printed form, right? And so he develops his dictionary that way, and its audience is a sort of a whole new group of people who are, say, businessmen who want to write letters and not look like rubes, or like I don't know English or something. There's sort of like this new sense of like, I want to present myself in print. Well, like already, how many people ever in the history of mankind presented themselves in print before this era of the 18th century, right? Not too many. And usually they didn't have to worry about how they expressed themselves, because if they were who they were, they expressed themselves and they defined the language, right? Well, now it's not so. There are people who are a little angsty about, I've learned a lot of things, but I just don't think I use words the right way sometimes. And can I look that up? Now, of course, the regularization of the orthography of the spelling is necessary if you're going to do a dictionary, because how do you look things up?
Right.
And those of us who are literary scholars, when we look things up in the Middle English Dictionary, it's horrific because there's all these spelling variants, right? And it's just crazy making. So this age of reason, if you will, in part led to an age of regularization, which then made it possible to have things like dictionaries in the first place. Now, in the 19th century, of course, James Murray's Oxford English Dictionary, since this had become a concept, there had been English dictionaries before Johnson, but they were very brief. And then Johnson's with this, really ambitious work. And then you get people at Oxford, such as James Murray, and he's like, I can see you and raise you. I'm going to make this even more ambitious and show you the whole historical trajectory of a given word by attestation across time. And of course, that's ongoing.
Right.
That's still ongoing, and it's electronic now.
Yeah.
It's fully electronic and really wonderfully highly searchable. So
how should we close this? Because as you mentioned, it is ongoing, right? The language is ongoing.
The language is ongoing. The study of it's ongoing.
Yes.
We haven't even covered 1/10 of the topics we might have.
That's right. We picked and choose. How do we want to close our conversation?
Well, all this keeps me off the streets. I just have to say. But, regularization very importantly plays into the development of computing. I mean, there are other aspects of mathematical study that also play into it, of course. But large language models of today, if you could run a large language model in Middle English, but wow, that would be crazier than if you have regularized texts for it to kind of play around with, right? Jonathan Swift, actually, in Gulliver's Travels, travels to this place called Logado, and there's this academy of projectors, and they have an engine where the head of the academy and his students sit about this machine. It's a square, and there's a bunch of words on the machine, and they turn cranks. And they just like avid, like, they just, crazy fast turn the cranks, and then they stop. And then it tells them things, and it gives them wisdom, right? And, hey, what are large language models doing, Right. I mean, ChatGPT. So I think that's where we end, right? Where we end by my inviting myself back to talk about large language models or whatever, right? About all of these other topics that we haven't yet covered.
Topic for a different time and a book for a different time as well. Dr. Pat Bart, Associate Professor of English here at Hillsdale College, as we talk about the history of the English language. Dr. Bart, thank you so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
And thank you so much, Scott.
That will wrap up this edition of the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. Our thanks to Andy Puzder, author of A Tyranny for the Good of Its Victims, and Dr. Pat Bart as we conclude our investigation into the history of the English language. Remember, you can hear new episodes every week on this station. You also can find extended versions of some of our interviews or listen anytime to the podcast. Find it at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio. Until next week, I'm Scot Bertram, and this has been the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.